Okay, sorry about that, guys. I have a 7-year-old who will occasionally come in and disrupt things just a little bit. So when we have these odd pauses or you have to switch between videos, just know that I've had some kind of interruption, and I don't necessarily want my 7-year-old walking around in her bathrobe on our videos here. So let's move on from here. So we know that the Portuguese are picking up slaves, and they're using them as cheap labor. And they're establishing trading posts in places like India, Mozambique, places like that. And so as they come back across, they're picking up people who, just so happen to speak Spanish speak Portuguese on the way, and they're using them as translators. And they're trying to get the goods that they're normally found in India and that are making their way across the land routes over into Europe. But this really jacks up the price of these goods super high. So they don't want to spend as much. They want to cut out the middleman, so that their goods can be sold cheaper and they can make more money, right? So if you look down at the next slide, you've got a map that shows all of Europe, and you can see the different trading routes that are going on at this point. So the places that are in red, those are the land routes coming over from China, and what they're doing is they're crossing over China, crossing over the top of India, and going over into Persia, coming out right there in the Holy Land and in Turkey and places like that, and they're using that as their base to sell goods and sell them into Europe. And then the Europeans are coming down from Italy, from Greece, from places like that, and they're traveling around the Mediterranean, and they're picking those pieces up at the Mediterranean and then bringing them back into European markets. And then from there they'll sail up the coast into Great Britain, what is present-day Great Britain, France, things like that. They'll travel up the rivers, sail up through the rivers, and go to different places, especially into France and into Italy. Rome will be a big place where they're selling goods. And so you can see in the blue, you can see where the Europeans mainly are traveling. So going down into Egypt, they're traveling from Jerusalem is one of the key points. Tyre is one of the key points, and they're traveling down the Nile, down into Egypt, and they're going through the bottom of Egypt, and they're going down into the that little Gulf of the Red Sea there, and they're going down and around Arabia and crossing over into India, and that's where the goods and things are coming from. So they're wanting to cut out essentially all of the red that's there, and they're wanting to make stops on those places and all of the places that the blue is. And so they're taking goods from those places, sailing back around the Horn of Africa, coming back up and coming back into the Mediterranean, so that those groups that are from the Mediterranean and are from Europe are able to have access to those goods at a cheaper price. So I'm hoping that makes sense to everybody. If you have questions, email me about it, okay? So once we have Christopher Columbus coming in, things will change quite substantially. They'll go from needing silks and spices and things like that to using people for specifically cheap labor and for precious metals. So as we start out, silks, which I've got a picture of silkworms on here and silk production on here. So if you look at the page that says goods, you can see up at the top there a picture of people producing silk in China, and it's being shipped across land into India. Then as you look down, you can see all of these spices, and all of these spices are extravagantly expensive. And because people are using them not only for spicing their foods, but they're using them for dyes, they're using them for all kinds of different things, for different types of production. So just keep that in mind as we go along here. And when Christopher Columbus sets out, he's really, truly trying to find a westward way to get into India, and so that he can get specifically these spices, because these spices are really where the money is. But as he goes over and he lands in Hispaniola, you'll see that things become more centered on cheap labor and precious metals. So in Hispaniola specifically, it starts out that there are about 250,000 natives on Hispaniola, and that's in 1492. So within less than 100 years, I think it's like 50 years, you go down from 250,000 natives to only 500 natives total, and that's it, because they're killing them all off in order to get these precious metals and to have them produce goods for them there, like sugars and things like that. So just keep that in mind as we go along. So with the Spanish will at one point, after they see how much money the Portuguese are making on, sailing around the Horn of Africa and going into India, the Spanish, after they push the Moors out of Spain, will be interested in this. And so you have this character of Christopher Columbus, who's born somewhere around 1451, and he lives until about 1506. He's the son of an Italian wool merchant. And they believe that very young in his life, he goes into like the mercantile system, where he becomes a sailor and he learns sailing. And, people make a big deal about, oh, the world was flat. Everyone thought the world was flat, and Christopher Columbus was the only one that thought the world was round. That's not true, even a little. Anybody who was educated at all knew that the world was round. Christopher Columbus was actually one of those people who were just horribly wrong about the size and the shape of the world at this point. Practically everyone thought the world was much bigger than what Christopher Columbus thought it was. So essentially, most people thought the world was like this, and Christopher Columbus thought the world was like this. And so he thought that you have Europe over here and Asia over here, and they were really, really close together, and that there wasn't anything in between, but nobody was brave enough to go out into the deep water of the Atlantic to be able to get it. They had no idea that the Americas were there at all. And most people thought that there was just a vast expanse of water between Europe and Asia, going to the west. But Christopher Columbus, he tries going to Portugal, he tries going to Italy, he tries to go to England, and convince them that the world is actually much smaller. And all of them are like, dude, you're an idiot. The world is much bigger than what you think it is. This will be an absolute flop, and it will not do us any good whatsoever. Well, eventually he goes to Isabella I of Spain. And so he convinces her to give him a couple of ships. So he has the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. So he's got 3 ships. There's also this kind of notion that the ships were made up of like prisoners of war and just prisoners in general, or slaves. So those tend to be like the 3 things that are normally brought up with this. They are not slaves, they're not prisoners, they're not former people who have been in Spanish prisons. They're just sailors, and they are outfitted for war by Isabella. And so they will go across. They'll be at sea for more than 3 months. And like I said, initially his estimate of how big the world was too low. But Isabella of Spain promises that if he does find anything, then he will be given the governorship, a title, and he'll get 10% of any profits that come from that land. And this is all after the Reconquista, which is where the Spanish monarchs will push the Moors out of Spain. And he'll take 4 voyages between 1492 and 1504. And there'll be approximately 40 people per ship, excuse me. And each ship is only about 50 feet long. If any of you guys ever have the chance to go see one of these ships, occasionally a recreation of one of these ships stops in Ashland. It stops right there at the boat docks in Ashland. It'll sail the Ohio River. And it's really cool to see, so if you ever get the chance to do it, you should absolutely do it. But you'll get an idea of how small that actually is. So in a normal classroom from one corner to the opposite corner is about 50 feet. So you're sticking 40 people on there, and they're staying on there for about 3 months. That's a really long time to be in a space that small, right? So you can pretty much go up and down the mast, and that's it, and you can't get away from anybody else. So it's really cramped quarters, and by the time this is all over, everybody's like, we need to turn back, we're all gonna die. We've been out here for 3 months, and we haven't seen land. Well, they see land, luckily, and they land in Hispaniola. All right, and you can see their routes down here. You can see kind of where they're coming from across, and you can see the different voyages. The picture's fairly small, but you should be able to kind of tell where they're going from. And so what they're doing is they're coming out from Spain, at the very base of Spain, right beside where Spain and Portugal meet, coming out of Gibraltar, and then they're coming down to the Canary Islands, and then they're attempting to sail straight across from the Canary Islands. And honest to goodness, Columbus is incredibly lucky when he does this, because he leaves, I believe it's in October, but he's right in the middle of hurricane season when he does this. So it's a miracle that he gets there at all, let alone gets there and makes 3 other trips and gets back. And if you look down in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see some of the later Spanish explorations into the New World. And they'll start off going just kind of around the islands that are in the Caribbean, and then they will eventually make it over to the Yucatan Peninsula, and then from the Yucatan they'll make their way all over the bottom of North America, and eventually they'll cross over and they'll go down into South America in the same kinds of voyages. But the Spanish will primarily be doing this in order to gain slaves, and they will kill off the local population in a very short time. There is a book, if any of you guys are interested in using it for one of your primary source document analyses. It's the life, essentially, of Bartolomeo de las Casas, and it is the tale of the atrocities that the Spanish will commit on the people of the New World. And I mean, it is absolutely brutal. But if it's something that you guys think you might want to do, I think it would be a really good one, and it would be really beneficial for a lot of people. But eventually, after the Spanish have been there for a while, and after the Spanish they've been making just a buttload of money, the English will want to get into this, and they'll try to do the same thing. They'll try to find a westward route into India, and they now know that there's a giant landmass there, but they still think that there's a way to get over to India, either through the north or by going through some kind of interior route to get over to India. And what they'll call this is the Northwest Passage. And the first one to really make a run at this will be John Cabot, and he will be the one credited with discovering North America in 1497. And he's commissioned by Henry VII of England. And that area will become known as Newfoundland. And like I said, it's an attempt for them to find a Northwest Passage. So they'll sail straight over from England to try to find a way, and that's my dog, to try to find a way to get into the Pacific, and then from there sail on to India. They don't find it, of course. But all of this kind of comes to a halt for a little while. And a lot of this is based on the fact that the English are having problems with the Spanish. So the Spanish Armada will come up, and they will attempt to attack England in 1588. And once that fails and the English defeat them, the English kind of become like the largest naval power in Europe. And from there, after the Spanish Armada, they'll attempt to establish colonies like the Spanish have done, in North America. And so they'll start off with their first one being Roanoke. And everyone has heard of Roanoke, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time there. But you've got Sir Walter Raleigh, who gets a charter from Elizabeth I in 1588, or excuse me, 1584. They will land there in, it's about July. It's July 4th, 1584. And they will leave a group of people there, and then they will sail back. Well, they return to the colony to find that the 115 people that they had left behind, they're gone or they're dead, and there's no sign of them other than the word Croatoan being carved into different places. And you guys can look up that it's a really cool primary source that you guys can look at. You can see it carved into a tree there in Roanoke. So if you guys want to do like say an arrowhead or something like that for your primary source document analysis, that might be a good piece for you guys to do. Or if you can find a journal entry from Sir Walter Raleigh or something like that, they're very, very cool. Very cool. Let's see. So moving on to Jamestown. So you can see the picture that shows the North Carolina, Virginia area. Oh, shoot. What's going on with my stuff here? Okay, yes. Okay. Sorry about that. My PowerPoint kind of went a little wild there for a while. But you can see the picture of North Carolina and Virginia there, and you can see where Roanoke is. And you can see that it's labeled as the Lost Colony. Well, right above that, you've got Jamestown. And for some reason, they thought it would just be the most fantastic idea to settle Jamestown under James I in a swamp. It's in April 1607. They settle in a swamp. Why on earth anyone would think that would be a good idea is beyond me, but they come over with these ideas that it's going to just be this really easy land to cultivate because it's right over across from England, and it'll be super easy for them. It's farther south than England, so it'll be super easy for them to have wonderful things that happen for them. They'll be able to plant, they'll be able to find gold, and they don't bring anything to actually eat or to plant with or anything like that. So when the Virginia Company of London, who gets the charter from James I, when they come over in 1607, half of them will be dead by September. Half of them. And then another 100 will arrive in January of the next year. And then again, half of them die very shortly thereafter because they burn Jamestown and they're freezing to death and they don't have any way to get food. They brought things like goldsmiths and metal workers, not farmers. They have no food. And the only reason that they survive at all is because the natives will bring them food. Well, a couple months thereafter, they feel like they're fairly well settled in. So in October of 1608, they have 70 extra settlers who come, 2 of which are women. And this is what historians count as the marker for the time that they feel that Jamestown is an established colony. And I want to clarify something about this. The only reason why anyone survived at Jamestown at all is because the pompous man, John Smith, saved them, essentially. So John Smith, horribly pompous man. You can find his diaries, and he refers to himself as the illustrious John Smith throughout the entire time that he's writing about himself in his journal. And his journals they're kind of funny. But he's attempting to find this Northwest Passage. So he's sailing up the rivers and talking about illustrious John Smith. Well, they nearly starve. And so he creates this idea of if you don't work, you don't eat. And you have to go to church all the time, or you don't eat. So the only reason that they survive at all is because he establishes this mindset of work or eat. Or, excuse me, work and you get to eat, don't work and you die. That's your only options. Well, shortly thereafter, the chief who had been feeding them, who had created a relationship with John Smith, And John Smith and Pocahontas were never in an intimate relationship. They had a brother-sister type relationship. And essentially what happened is the Powhatan, who was the chief over what they call the Powhatan Confederacy, they couldn't actually pronounce his name, so they just wrote it down as Powhatan because it was easier to pronounce and easier to spell. So Chief Powhatan adopted John Smith as his son, and that's the reason why he continued to feed them. And so he and Pocahontas never had like an intimate relationship or anything like that. Well, when these 70 extra settlers come, he says, enough! I'm not feeding you people anymore. I've already had to feed you guys to get you through the winter for the last couple of years. I'm not doing it. And they consider this to be the starving time. And it's from winter of about 1609 to winter of 1610. And the settlers will eat everything from rats to human remains. And we have one specific example that if you go to Jamestown now and you ask them about, they won't tell you about it. But they've actually found human remains of a 14-year-old girl named Jane Fort who died at Jamestown. And her bones show signs of the flesh being peeled off of her bones so that they could eat her remains. And the people who did that were, we assume they were punished, and there were laws against things like that. Hello, Oscar. But they were so hungry, and they were so tightly kept within their fort. And you can see their fort up here. So you've got disease running rampant, rats running rampant, things like that. And then you've got dead humans everywhere falling over from starvation. But they're taking their remains and they're eating them. Well, by 1611, you start seeing the emergence of tobacco as a cash crop. And so it's not as important that people be able to produce food because they can buy food from England and have it shipped over. It's not fantastic food, but it's something to eat, and they aren't starving to death. But the person who brings this over is John Rolfe, and he was initially supposed to be one of the settlers in one of the first groups. But his ship got shipwrecked over at Bermuda, and he found tobacco seeds there. And he brings those over, and they just happen to work really super well in Virginia. And so he makes a lot of money growing this crop and then selling it back to England. And the natives in the Virginia area did have some version of tobacco, and so Pocahontas became a really important figure in helping them establish tobacco as a cash crop. And then from there, you start seeing just an explosion of tobacco growing everywhere. There's one account that says that you can't drive a horse through the streets because there's tobacco growing in the streets because everyone's making money off of this tobacco. Well, this emergence of tobacco and this gaining of power through money, through tobacco, will lead to the Virginians being able to govern themselves, and they'll establish something called the Charter of Grants and Liberties, and it establishes a General Assembly in Virginia, which they'll call the House of Burgesses, in 1919. And they call this period the period of salutary neglect, because you've got James and his sons who are in a civil war in England at this point. I believe it's by this point, but they're in a civil war, and their minds aren't exactly on anything that's going on in the American colonies. It's not particularly important at this point. But they will come back over, and they will eventually attempt to retake those areas and reestablish control in those areas, which will lead to our own American Revolution. But that's a couple years down the road, so don't worry about that at this point. But one of the really important pieces of this is that there are slaves that are brought to Jamestown in 1619. And so there was a slave who had been in Florida since about 1581. they'd been brought there by the Spanish. And then there are some slaves that are in the New Netherlands in about 1626 or so. But by 1640, you have John Punch, who's the first man to serve lifelong imprisonment as a slave in Virginia. Um, and he initially starts out as an indentured servant, which was kind of like a popular form of low-wage workers. Um, since the charter was established. But at one point, he attempts to get out of his indentured servitude by running away, and he's punished by becoming the first slave. And you can see some of that at this SharonDapper.com/timeline PDF, and it's kind of neat. You can kind of see the timelines of when slavery really starts coming up in the New World. And here in just a moment, I'll show you guys an actual indenture. It's not from this period exactly, but it is really, really stinking cool, and I will show it to you here in just a moment. So colonies to follow, you've got the Plymouth colony in about 1620, you've got the Manhattan colony, which will become New York, in about 1626, and it's bought by the Dutch, but they're later forced out by the English, and they buy that land from the Native Americans. 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is given a charter. In 1632, you've got the Maryland Colony, which is made primarily for Catholics. Thomas Hooker moves into Connecticut in about 1636, and this is a time when they create the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639, and it's considered to be the first constitution of the Americas by some. Others consider the establishment of a General Assembly to be really the first constitutional type piece. And some people even consider the charters given by James to be the first governing constitutions of these areas. And then moving on from there, in 1663, you've got the Province of the Carolinas created. William Penn will be given land for the Quakers in Pennsylvania, because he's a buddy of the king, and he helped reestablish the king at one point in the English Civil War, but it's not particularly important for this class. Delaware will separate from Pennsylvania in 1701, and then in 1702 you'll have the colony of New Jersey. 1712, North and South Carolina will split. In 1732 you'll have the province of Georgia, which will form. 1754 through 63, you'll have the French and Indian War, where they will gain Florida and a little bit of other North American territory. And then you'll start seeing a lot of civil unrest and American unrest leading up to the Revolutionary War in 1765 through 1777. So I'm going to briefly try to get you guys through the American Revolution, the rise of the Whigs, the Mexican-American War, and going on into the Civil War from here. So now that you can kind of see where slavery is really starting out in the New World, we're going to start looking at some of the effects of slavery from this point forward. So from the squabbles between property rights and state rights that are ratified in the Articles of Confederation, which is the United States' first governing document as a group of states, and it's ratified in 1781, we'll start seeing issues of things like, what are we going to do with slaves? What are we going to do with this population of people who have been working for us? What are we going to do with indentured servants? What are we going to do with these people? How are we going to set up our government? And it's a really loose structure at this point. There's a very small central government. They don't have anything like the power to tax, the power to do much of anything. They can mint coins, and the Articles of Confederation will say that the states are independent and that they can only be united in war times. So other than that, they're kind of like these little separate individual countries And it just doesn't function well at all, which will eventually lead us to create our current Constitution in 1788. So it only lasts about 7 years. But really the call for its abolition is from Shays' Rebellion. And what will happen is that during this rebellion, it's right after we've won the American Revolution, and you'll have Daniel Shays, who will lead about 4,000 rebels, who they'll call Shaysites, against an armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. And they're just horribly ticked off because they fought in a war and they're about to be imprisoned for not paying taxes. So they've not been paid the whole time through the American Revolution, because there's no money. There's no money coming in from tax to be able to pay soldiers. And so the Constitutional Congress, they didn't pay their soldiers. So you've got all of these guys, these 4,000 guys who are all about to be in prison for not paying their taxes. And they have no money to pay their taxes with. And so they go and they will try to take this armory in an attempt to overthrow the government. But George Washington, who is elderly by this point, supposedly will go up to these guys. He'll go up to these members of the military, former members of the military, and he'll take them and he'll sit them all down and he'll say, "Look, I am so sorry that all of this has happened, but you and me, we can work this out." And he essentially takes these guys and talks them out of being like horribly angry, and eventually they'll take Daniel Shays and they'll say, "Okay, we'll pardon you. You can get away. Just don't come back to Massachusetts. It'll be all right. We understand that you're upset. We're not going to imprison you." And he kind of like de-escalates the situation here. But they will make George Washington, because of his power from leading soldiers in the Revolutionary War, they will take him and they'll make him the president of the Constitutional Convention, and he'll become the first president of the United States. And the crucial piece of this for our class at this moment is that slavery is protected in the United States until 1808, and it will include slaves in the population count for being 2/5 of a person. So they won't count them as a whole person, only 2/5 of a person. And this will be key in trying to figure out representation in Congress and in the Senate. So we'll see this a little later down the road, but just understand that for the Civil War, this is incredibly important that they're 2/5 of a person, because it will tell the southern states how much representation that they can have in Congress, and it will determine how states going westward will want to be represented. So from here, we have some issues with the War of 1812 and the Chesapeake and Leopard affair. Really what you need to know is that you've got a couple of deserters, two of which are African Americans, who will become, part of the British Navy, and it will lead and spark into the War of 1812. You guys can read over this little bit here. Let me know if you have any questions about it. The Chesapeake is abbreviated as Chess, C-H-E-S. It's really not that important. I will tell you that you might have a question about this on your test, and it's simply that asking what are impressed soldiers. An impression is where you'll have British soldiers who will go off and they will hang out on American ships, and they'll desert the British Navy, and the British Navy will hop aboard ships of other countries and try to take them back, and they will call it impressing. And occasionally you'll have other people from other nations who are put into the British Navy because they're fighting the French at this point, and it just kind of gets blown up out of proportion. And that's really about all you need to know. But this will cause uproar within the Whigs. And the Whigs are a political party of the early to mid 1800s. They don't last very long. It's about 1834 to 1854. And they're founded by Henry Clay, William Henry Harrison, David Webster, and Horace Greeley. And of this, they will have 2 presidents who come out of the Whig Party with 5 candidates, which is fairly impressive for that 20-year span, especially considering that not long after this, our current political parties will be born, and they've lasted for like 100 years. And so the Whigs, to have only lasted 20 years and to have 2 presidents, 5 presidential candidates, it's rather impressive. But they have their origins in Jacksonian politics. And what we mean by Jacksonian is that it comes from the Jacksonian era, which is the time of Jackson's election in 1828 to approximately the Civil War. And they'll call this the second party system. And so in 1831, you'll have Henry Clay, who will start planning this party based on national interest and placing them above sectional ones. So the idea of the nation, of America as a whole, that kind of gets put into place starting in about the American Revolution, will move over into a more prominent role than, just the North, just the South, just Virginia, just New Hampshire. And so they'll take that idea as a whole and they'll work with it from there. So when you look at the Whigs are practically the exact opposite of the Jacksonians. So you've got the Whigs, who are considered to be modernizing figures. And they have this Jeffersonian idea of compromising, and we just need to work together and we'll make all of these things work out. Well, their idea is that they fought long enough. They fought the War of 1812. They've fought in the Revolutionary War. They're not particularly interested in kind of making this a sectional government. And they want to strengthen the existing systems. They want to strengthen, the ability to build roads. They don't want to deal with slavery at this point as an issue. They don't want to deal with manifest destiny, this idea of moving westward in order to get more land. They need to take care of things at home before they move westward. And they will use this whole principle to call the grab of Texas and the gaining of Texas as an unprincipled land grab. They'll support a balanced government where the amount of money going out will be equal to the amount of money coming in, and expanding the government, making more government programs available. National unity is a huge piece of their governmental ideas. They want to have federally produced transport and infrastructure. So they want to build railroad systems and roads and things like that. Domestic manufacturing will be a key piece of their politics. So they will want to, instead of getting raw goods from the Americas and sending them over to Europe, having Europe refine those goods and then send them back, they don't want that. That's really a Jacksonian kind of thing. They want domestic manufacturing. And then Henry Clay will kind of start proposing high tariffs as a part of the American system, what he calls the American system anyways. And these tariffs will be used to produce and promote industry, a national bank, federally subsidized funds for roads and internal improvement, revenue off of our own American land. They want to stabilize and regulate local and state banks and create a national currency that's really a strong national currency. So in the presidential elections in 1836, they're not large enough really to have a national candidate. But by 1840, William Henry Harrison will be nominated and will win the presidency. John Taylor will become president after William Henry Harrison dies of pneumonia. And he's in office for all of about a month, and then he gets sick with pneumonia and dies. But John Tyler will be expelled from the party for vetoing a piece of Whig economic legislation in 1841. And so you'll see this issue of internal unity being a problem within the Whigs. And it will be really the biggest piece of why the Whigs will fall apart from here. Henry Clay will be nominated in 1844, but he won't win the presidency. And that's mostly because he's associated with upper class men. And so men without property at this point can't vote. So they really don't want him to become president. And then you'll see General Zachary Taylor, who's nominated and elected in 1848, but this will be the last president from the Whig Party to be elected. Now, on the other hand, you've got the Jacksonians, who completely opposed the Bank of the United States, which is something that the Whigs are huge supporters of. And here it's abbreviated as BUS, B-U-S. They're not particularly interested in many internal improvements. With the Whigs, you'll see them being supporters of egalitarian democracy, which means that they want all men to be able to vote equally across the board, which is why it was a good platform, but it's the whole reason why Clay wasn't nominated, because he wasn't seen as wanting an egalitarian democracy enough. So the Jacksonians are completely opposed to it. They want more state power. They want really good hard money made out of precious metals. And they will support protective tariffs, which we will see that Henry Clay also is approving of tariffs. But it's really seen as more of a compromise than what we'll see coming out of the Jacksonians. But the thing about this is that on this import-export tax of tariffs, it protects American markets by buying American goods. And so, for the most part, New England will benefit from this. And Southern detractors will call these the tariffs of abomination. And this will eventually lead directly to the nullification crisis in 1832 through 1837, where South Carolina will declare these tariffs to be completely unconstitutional. And they were the tariffs of 1828 and 1832. And so these tariffs are completely unconstitutional. You can't put tariffs on these things, and it does direct harm to the southern states. And this was kind of viewed as the precursor to the Civil War. So what will happen is that there'll be a 62% tax on 92% of imports. Like I said, this will directly impact the southern economy. So as an example of this, you've got the UK that produces items that the US can't and doesn't. And so when the United States will sell their goods, say cotton, to the UK for them to produce, they'll have to buy these at a higher price, because the UK will have to buy these at a higher price because of the tariffs, which means that they won't buy as much. And so from there, the UK isn't purchasing as much cotton. And since they're not producing as much cotton goods, and they're not purchasing as much cotton goods, then the South will just kind of fall into economic decline. And so they'll start going to places like India, to Egypt, and they'll be getting cotton from other places, which will further this economic decline of the South. So you can see why the South would see this as an economic abomination, and we aren't going to support this, and so we're going to get rid of this by any means necessary, even if that means that we say we aren't going to be a southern state or a state of this union at all. So you can see kind of where this is born at. And then you've got additional problems that are brought on by the Mexican-American War, so from 1846 to 1848, and they'll call this Polk's War. Polk was the president at the time, and really this is a border dispute. This will show you why many of the Whigs view this as a horrible land grab for Texas. But you've got a bunch of Kentuckians who will really enthusiastically support this war, and they'll send a ton of troops there. But it's a border dispute where Mexico says that the border starts at the Nueces River and is south of the Nueces River. And then you've got the United States that says that starting at the Rio Grande, that's the border, and it goes south from there. So the government will request 2 regiments of infantry and 1 regiment of cavalry. But in Kentucky specifically, which I thought you guys would find cool, you have more than 100 units volunteering. They'll request 2,400 troops total, and they will get 13,000 volunteers. And so 5,000 approximately will serve. And of those 5,000, 500 will die of disease. Less than 100 will die from actual combat. But you'll see the figure of Zachary Taylor, who is a Kentuckian, and he'll be called Old Rough and Ready. He'll become instantly famous because of his success in the Mexican-American War, and he will eventually support the Whigs and will eventually become a Whig president. So from the time that Polk, from the time of the Mexican-American War forward, we'll really start to see the Whigs declining. And this will mainly be because of issues of nativism, prohibition, and slavery that are coming to the forefront in the 1850s. Nativism is really where we'll start seeing issues of, oh, you're from Ireland. You can't come to the United States and get a job within the United States. You're not a native of the United States, so you don't belong here. You can't be a citizen of the United States. You'll see issues with prohibition. Prohibition being people wanting to get rid of the sale of alcohol, and slavery in the mid-1850s. So Clay and Webster, who are dead by this point, are really the ones who were holding the party together. After their death, it completely loses power. So with Compromise of 1850, you'll see the Whigs are split between slavery and anti-slavery. And it had initially had not been a problem within the Whig group, the Whig Party, but it will essentially tear them apart. And so there'll be 5 bills passed by Congress in September of 1850, and these will determine slave status of territories taken in the Mexican-American War. It'll be written by Clay, who was a Democrat, and Stephen Douglas. And Texas will surrender the New Mexican territory and any claims above the 3630 line, so latitude and longitude 3630. And you can see it's the area that's in pink on your bottom United States map here. That's that line, okay? But it will keep, it will surrender these territories to the federal government to help pay off debts, but they'll get to keep the panhandle. So there won't be any slaves in Texan lands above the Missouri Compromise line. So that's that straight line going across the bottom of Missouri, which is where you get that 3630 line for this compromise. And then they'll say that California is free. Now, this is really important because it affects how they're represented in Congress. So you have slave states that are kind of fighting the North. The North has a lot more states, individual states, than the South. And so in the Senate, they have more power. While in the House of Representatives, because they've got this 2/5 Act, they'll be roughly equal in the House of Representatives for representation. Well, you've got Texas that comes in as a slave state, and then you've got California that comes in as a free state, and between the two of them, they keep the representation fairly equal. And so you'll start seeing that the representation in Congress and in the Senate will kind of shift out of balance as time goes on. And this is really scary for a lot of Southerners, and will eventually be one of the primary causes for the Civil War. You've got the slave trade that is banned in D.C., so you can see that they're starting to really be afraid of losing slave power in the South. So they'll fight for more stringent fugitive slave laws. They'll attempt to outlaw slavery in all of the new territories that are gained in the Mexican-American War, which is all of those areas that are gained in orange. The Wilmot Proviso, which suggested this, is not successful. But at the same point, it's really a scary time for them. And these are part of those 5 laws that are written. But you have, like I said, more stringent fugitive slave laws. You've got Utah and the New Mexico territory, where the slave status is going to be determined by popular sovereignty. So they will vote to see if they'll be a slave state or not. And the same issue that was born of this popular sovereignty will cause major problems in Kansas and Nebraska, in those territories that will become Kansas and Nebraska. So with that, they will again determine their slave status, and this will lead to a problem called Bleeding Kansas, where you have 2 governments that kind of pop up, and one's a slave government and one's a not slave government, and they go about killing each other until the federal government steps in and says, okay, here's what's going to happen. We're going to redo this, and they eventually work it all out. But it's a very scary time if you're in Kansas and Nebraska there for a little while. But this whole time that all of this is going on, you've got a movement called abolition that's growing in the United States. And for this, I'm going to focus mainly on Kentucky, because Kentucky is kind of a unique case. In Kentucky, it's a southern state with economic ties to the north through tobacco and hemp and things like that. So they're kind of torn between the two, and you'll have a really deep abolitionist movement in a southern state in Kentucky. So with Kentucky, the abolitionist movement will come around in about the 1790s with the Presbyterian minister David Rice, and his idea that how to put this? In 1790, he'll attempt to get abolition into the state constitution. And then again in about 1880, you'll have another push for it through the Kentucky Abolitionist Society. And this is established by Baptist minister David Barrow and Carter Tarrant. And so they'll start publishing slave periodicals, anti-slave periodicals. And they'll be saying slavery is wrong, you shouldn't do this. And this will lead to more anti-slave periodicals. And so this will really be a growing trend in Kentucky. And it's really initially pushed by ministers and by people who are trying to promote Christian religion as a motive for treating your slaves well and for setting them free. You know, they'll hearken back to Moses, and they'll hearken back to treating your slaves well, and that people should be free and things like that. So from this periodical that's created by Tarrant and Barrow, you'll have the Louisville Examiner, and it'll be published from 1847 to 1849. And then you'll also have the True American, published by Cassius Marcellus Clay, starting in about 1845. And we'll get to more of him in a minute. But most of these proposed gradual emancipation, so a gradual freeing of American slaves. And they will suggest that they send slaves back into Liberia in an area that they call Monrovia, and it's called the Monrovian Project, named after President Monroe. And this is an established American colony. Like I said, it's named after President James Monroe in Africa. And so you've got these slaves who have grown up in America, and they have no idea how to function outside of America. And they're suggesting that you can just send them back to Africa and they'll be fine, but you've already got Africans who are living in this colony. So you can't exactly just push them back into there. You've got a small group of them that will go back, and they will just be a complete flop and establishing a colony there. It doesn't work. So gradual emancipation kind of eventually will fall to the wayside, but it takes a while to die out. But probably the most famous Kentucky abolitionist is Cassius Marcellus Clay, and oh my gosh, is he a cool dude! So I mentioned to you guys that like really barbaric pieces of history I find particularly interesting. He is a really cool Kentuckian in this case. So if I seem a little excited about this, it's because he's really freaking cool. He's like, you'll see. So he's a Kentucky planter. He's a politician, and he's an abolitionist. So his father had been a slaveholder, and Clay had been so opposed to being a slaveholder that as soon as he inherited, he freed all of his slaves. And in an 1843 debate, a man named Sam Brown will attempt to assassinate him. He'll shoot him in the chest. And he just happened to be lucky, and he will pull out his Bowie knife, and he's got this Bowie knife with him at all times. Clay will pull out his Bowie knife, and he'll tackle Brown to the ground, and then he will cut out Brown's right eye and part of his nose and his left ear, and then he'll take him and he'll throw him over an embankment. And his life is saved by his Bowie knife case, this Bowie knife that he just almost killed a man with. It saved his life. It caught the bullet. It's the only reason that he survived at all, is this Bowie knife case. And so from this point forward, he'll keep that Bowie knife on him at all times. And throughout his entire life, that Bowie knife will continue to save his life. But starting in about 1845, he starts publishing True American in Lexington. And he will initially barricade the doors, and he will armor the doors, and he'll have 2 cannons that he sets up as protection for the True American. And it, like I said, it's a periodical. It's an anti-slave periodical, and his offices will be attacked by a mob, and they'll seize his equipment, and so unfortunately he wasn't really able to protect it as well as he had hoped. But he'll eventually move True American from being a Lexington-based newspaper, and he'll move it over to Cincinnati, Ohio. Later on, he'll remain in Kentucky, but later on, in about 1849, Clay is attacked again by the sons of a political rival after an anti-slave speech. And this man's name was Cyrus Turner, and he and his 5 sons will surround Clay, and they'll punch him and club him, and then they'll take away his trusted Bowie knife, and they'll stab him, and they'll attempt to murder him. They'll put a gun up to his head, and the gun misfires. So as they're attempting to stab him to death with his own Bowie knife, he gets his Bowie knife back somehow, and the attackers, they just scatter. They run away. They're absolutely terrified. And despite the fact that he's been stabbed and that he's nearly shot in the head, he'll chase them down, and he will kill Cyrus Turner. And all of this time, his son is watching, and his son is just absolutely terrified. But he will get them back, and he'll murder Cyrus Turner. And the other attackers will just kind of scatter and flee. But in 1853, he'll give 10 acres of land. After he survives this brutal attack, he'll give 10 acres of land to John F. Fee, who will establish Berea College in 1855, which is open to all races. And it's the only college of its kind. And eventually it will lead to a court case where they will reinforce this idea of racial inequality. But that's a little while down the road. We'll probably circle back to that at some point. But moving on with Clay's life, and we're going to finish up with Clay here. And when he turns 92, 3 men will break into his house, and he'll shoot one, and then he'll disembowel one with his Bowie knife, and then he'll seriously wound another. So he's kind of like this really just terrifying, brutal man who is absolutely 100% against the brutalities of slavery. So he's kind of one of these oxymoronical characters who are larger than life, and he'll become famous in Kentucky, and especially within the African American community. And he will be the one who the great American boxer Muhammad Ali will initially be named after. And it's because of his work in disestablishing slavery as an institution. And so I just kind of wanted to show you a little newspaper article that comes out of this. And this is written by a local historian named Fred Allen Engel. And he's from here in Kentucky, and essentially what he does is he goes into some archives and he finds other newspaper articles of this interaction between Clay and the Turners, and so you guys can read that, and it's really a cool document. But remember, this is not a primary source, this is a secondary source, because it's this man writing about something that happened in the past. Those newspaper accounts that he got from the Library of Congress and from the other places there in the archives, that's where the primary sources are from. So I'll wrap it up with that. I'll let you guys read over that. It's pretty stinking cool, but I want to end with one last thing, and that's how I think of Cassius Marcellus Clay. He's essentially the Rambo of the South, fighting for equalities and freedoms, and you really just don't mess with Cassius Marcellus Clay, because if you do, then in 3 seconds you're going to find out what the same guy finds out. So have a good week. Take a peek over these 3 links that I've got here. If you go and you just pull up your PowerPoint, you can just hit Control and then click these links that are on here, and they will take you directly to the YouTube videos, and you'll get a few generalizations about the Civil War, and that'll be a good start for when we come back for Reconstruction next week. So guys, have a good weekend. I will send out a new copy of the class schedule starting here. I'm going to kind of explain things to you now, but I will send out an official copy of it starting with next week. So for today, you guys had to read Chapter 1 and the introduction, write a summary on it, and then write an assessment of that. Okay? Next week, you'll have only Chapter 2, because it turns out that the physical copy of it, not the audiobook, only has 9 chapters. So read Chapter 2, summary and assessment. The week after that, Chapter 3, summary and assessment. And you'll just follow that all the way through until you get to Chapter 9. Each week, you will have 1 chapter that's due for a summary and assessment. On the 10th week, you will have to write a summary and assessment of the entire book. Okay, and that's where we're going to leave out with the summaries and assessments. And I will post that as a class schedule, as an updated class schedule today. So it might be a little after 4:30, but you guys will have it. So guys, have a good week, and I look forward to meeting you guys again next week. Email me if you have questions or issues or anything like that. If I don't answer, please feel free to call me. So you guys have a good day. See you guys next week.